Hello and welcome to week 6, where we are talking about residential service options for systems involved youth, as well as adoption and emancipation. I am not going to touch on emancipation too much here because it's not something I have a ton of expertise about, and it's also not something that happens all that commonly in my experience. It is a pretty tall order on the part of the youth to become emancipated. If that's something that folks have a lot of questions about and are really curious about, let me know. I can do some additional research and try to get you some more information before the end of the quarter. But I don't want to present wrong information if that's not something, or I don't want to present wrong information at all, but I don't want to go through a bunch of information if that's something that people aren't interested in, because again, it really doesn't happen that often. I'm not sure I've ever met a youth who is formally emancipated. What is more common, I think, is that you see young people who are all but emancipated. You know, they might be making it work, figuring out how to pay their own bills, living outside of their home of origin, but without any formal legal arrangement in place. And then they kind of get stuck and can't actually make their own legal decisions, but then might not have access to the caregiver who can. I think that's much more common. Again, happy to speak to that more if that's interesting to people. But for the sake of time, knowing that we're getting to the end of the quarter, and for the sake of everyone's brains, I'm not going to dig too far into that. The things I do want to touch on, I think just briefly, again, knowing that we're getting to the end of the quarter, people are probably starting to feel a little bit fried, and I don't want to add to that. I just want to touch on a few things related to both adoption and residential services. So let's start with adoption. I think when we're talking about adoption in this class, we're really talking about adoption for kiddos who have been systems involved. So kids coming from foster care. There is a lot that goes in to the progression from a child being removed from their home of origin to being adopted, either by another family member, by a foster parent, whoever. And it's a really long process. I have found in my work and in the people I've interacted with that you are much more likely to see this with younger kids. And even when the level of concern initiating the contact with the child welfare system was really high, this process takes a really long time. So as we've talked about in earlier modules, this process really gets started when a concern is high enough that a child is removed from their family of origin. After that, if a child is placed in out-of-home care, either with another family member or with a foster family, there is a long time, for good reason, as we've talked about, because really permanency and family reunification is always the goal. There is a really long time where all of the parties involved in this are in and out of family court. There are services being placed into the home of origin. There are visits going on. Sometimes these visits are supervised, sometimes they're not. There is all this stuff happening in the background, trying to see if the system can sort of stabilize that home of origin in order for those kids to return to the home of origin. Sometimes they do, and DCYF will close out their case and that's it. Sometimes they might return for a while. It doesn't work out. They end up coming back into care. And sometimes children are removed and just are never able to be safely placed back into that home of origin. If that is the case, we've got this kiddo moving through, I would say, likely years of systems involvement, of visits, of attempts at reunification. If it gets to the point where the system as a whole decides that this is no longer productive, or that the safety concerns are just too high, that the biological parent isn't showing that they are actually trying, it may get to a point where that parents' rights are terminated. Again, this takes a really long time. The standard is really, really high. It does not happen all that often, in my experience. I'm not sure what percentage of cases that come into care end in this result, but my guess would be that it's on the lower side, again, because the standard is very high for a parent to lose their rights, as it should be, because this is kind of an irreversible thing that, as we've talked about, does a lot of harm to a family unit, even if the unit in question was really unsafe. So theoretically, if we go through all of this and a parent's rights are terminated, then that child would be determined legally freed and can be placed for adoption, either in the foster home they're already in or in a different home if the home that they've been in either changes their mind, decides they're not willing to adopt, was never interested in adopting, and it really looked like that child was going to go back to their home of origin, or something else happens. There is a world where parents can voluntarily relinquish their parental rights, which would ultimately kind of end up in the same place. Again, I think this happens very infrequently. In my experience, even parents who may not be showing us as a system that they're interested in parenting, most parents would not voluntarily give up the right to parent their children, which is really understandable. Through all of that, it's complicated enough, but there are additional considerations that make this even more complicated. And we've talked about some of these before, so I won't harp on them too much, but I do just kind of want to rattle them off. We've talked about age. Younger children are more likely to get adopted than older children are. There are some readings and videos in this module that talk about teenagers and youth in foster care. We've talked about that in past modules. And the fact of the matter is, it is harder for older children to be placed in the first place, even just in a foster home, and to be adopted, especially if that child has kind of either maybe had some challenges when they came into care or has kind of developed some behavioral challenges as a result of all of this instability. The more those build, the harder it is to find a placement for that young person. When we think about groups of siblings, that can also make it more challenging. The goal would always be to keep siblings together. This family is already being destabilized, is already being pulled apart. If they can keep those siblings together, they will. However, that does make it harder. The more siblings there are, and I would say the age range of those siblings makes it even harder to place those kids. So it does happen sometimes that siblings are not able to be placed together, and maybe that some siblings can be placed and some can't. And each sibling is technically a different case. And so the placement journey for different kids within the same family might not be the same. And the potential termination of parental rights for siblings within the same family actually might not be the same as well. We touched on this, I think, 2 weeks ago, but when thinking about things like language, culture, race, religious background, there are a lot of ways that a foster child can be different than the family of origin. Some of these, there are kind of rules and protections around. In terms of culture and religion, there are actually rules in place for kind of both the placement family and the child, where DCYF can't discriminate against a foster family based on their religious beliefs, but also the foster family can't impose those religious beliefs on the child. I would imagine that some of these things maybe are on paper and go differently in practice. I don't know for sure. I don't have anecdotal or data to back that up, but these are things that are really personal to people, and having a member of your household that doesn't view the world the same way, that doesn't engage with one of your key supports the same way, is bound to be a little bit complicated. We talked about how language can be really challenging, especially the rarer the language, the harder it's going to be to find a placement that speaks that language. I remember a case that I worked on in my first job before I moved out to Seattle, and it was a pre-adoptive foster home, and the parent ended up adopting the child, and the mom spoke almost entirely Spanish. She spoke a little bit of English, and the child she was adopting spoke English and spoke very little Spanish. And they made it work. We made it work, but it was, I think, an interesting illustration that, yes, this is a really key difference, and sure, there are situations where you can make it work, but it may not be in the best interest of that child to have a caregiver that they can't communicate with. Another thing that I believe we touched on last time, and that some of the videos touch on, is race. When we're thinking about, a child of color being placed with a white family, there is a lot that family needs to do to responsibly care for that child who is from a different racial background than they are. Families can do a lot of harm if they ignore or aren't educated on the differences between themselves and the child they're caring for. And I haven't worked within the child welfare system. I don't know what efforts are in place to make sure folks are focusing on that. And I think there are probably times in history where it wasn't something that the system felt the need to think about, and I hope that we're doing better with it, but my gut says that it probably depends on where you are and individual families more than anything else. So if anyone has stories they've heard or cases that they are aware of, please feel free to share about that, or about any of this, really. And then the last thing in terms of adoption I want to touch on, and placement more generally, is the need for foster parents to be affirming of things like gender identity and sexuality. Again, while DCYF can't discriminate against a foster family based on their kind of cultural or religious views around these topics, the foster family absolutely still has to be affirming of that child. That is in the WAC. I'm forgetting the acronym, but the Code of Washington. And it's absolutely unacceptable for a child to be in any of these categories, but I'll focus on gender and sexuality right now. It's absolutely unacceptable for a gender diverse child or a child who identifies as LGBTQIA+ to be in a home that is not affirming. It's just not okay, and it's goes against Washington state law. So that was a lot about adoption. For residential services, I'm going to keep it pretty short. I just have a couple things I want to highlight. One resource that I see is missing in Washington state, and that I was trying to do some Googling around and didn't really find, and that I haven't seen much in my own practice, is this concept of group homes. So I lived in New York City before I lived here, and I started my social work career out there. And it wasn't uncommon for youth who were a little bit harder to place, especially teenagers, to be placed in these group home settings where it's, maybe 5 or 6 unrelated or related kids placed in a home with staff, basically. So there might be 1 or 2 staff members for every however many kids, but they're essentially living in a home where no one's related to each other. And I don't know if there maybe are facilities like this in Washington. I just can't find them. When I looked on the DCYF website, there is a page about licensing facilities like this. But again, it's not something that I've experienced in my work, and I would be surprised if I hadn't heard of this in the 10 years that I've been working out here. So I think that those homes kind of come with their own potential issues. When you get a lot of young people around the same age in the same household, they're not guaranteed to like each other, just like with siblings. And especially if these kids come into these situations with historical trauma, with behavioral issues, I don't know the stats, but I would imagine there's probably an increased likelihood for folks to potentially escalate in a situation like that. But I also think there's a lot of value in these resources, over things like having a child who can't be placed and then ends up in a youth shelter. I would imagine there's some psychosocial value to a group home. And again, I don't know why we don't have them out here, or if we do and I just haven't heard of them. So if it sounds familiar to you, either just by word of mouth or in work you've done, please feel free to let the group know. As always, in the discussion post that we'll do this week, you can always throw extra stuff in there if you need to. And then the last thing I want to touch on, I think, is just this idea of what happens if a child who is systems involved elopes and doesn't want to go back for whatever reason. Either the caregiver won't take them back, they don't want to go back, or it's determined to be kind of a mutually not a good fit, either the home of origin or a foster home. And this, I think we talked about when we were talking about aging on foster care. This is a really tricky situation, and there are really not a lot of good resources for these kinds of kids. Excuse me, the module talked a little bit about these residential crisis centers, which are great for a couple of days to try to help a situation de-escalate and hopefully keep that situation intact. But there are a lot of times where things have gotten to the point where a few days isn't going to make a big difference. And a lot of these kids don't have great options. We absolutely see kids who are systems involved ending up in youth shelters, ending up continuing to elope from situations that either don't feel safe or just aren't a good fit for them, and being really vulnerable for these kind of higher risk situations, really vulnerable to trafficking, really vulnerable to becoming unhoused and kind of becoming lost to the system that, at least in theory, is trying to support them. It's an area where I think the system needs to do a lot of work, and where, in my opinion, we don't have a lot of great resources, especially for these teenagers who are really close to aging out and then have the potential to just end up in a really, really unsafe, unsupported situation where they no longer have access to a lot of the resources that they would have when they were a legal minor. So that's where I'll stop this for this week. Let me know if you have any questions about this or about the other material. The reflection for this week is going to ask you to kind of put yourself into the mindset of a child in a situation like this, and I'll be really interested to hear what folks have to say.